Good afternoon and welcome to the Department of Behavioral Health Weekly Update. I am Dewan Utek. We'll get started. It remains for the last day Suicide Prevention and Recovery Month. We've had a lot of activities this month. I'm really excited that there was a really successful event this week where we had many of the police chiefs from across the valley come together in support of education to gun stores and gun shop owners about gun safety. Not a rights thing, it's not about the right to bear arms, but really to say for those in our community who exercise their right to bear arms, what are some risks in not securing your gun safely? And we do know that for suicides in Fresno County, death by gunshot is the highest mode of completed suicide. And so we just want to make sure that residents in the county who do own guns understand that keeping those guns safe and secure could save their life or someone else's life. So it was really good to see our police chief, our law enforcement partners partner with us in that regard. It remains National Latino Hispanic Heritage Month, and so you'll see some additional activities for that. Moving on to COVID. We're now over 233 million cases of COVID worldwide, approaching 4.8 million deaths, now 6.2 billion doses of vaccine. I really can't emphasize enough how many doses of vaccine that is. That is a lot of vaccine. For those of you who might remain vaccine hesitant or vaccine resistant, that is so many doses of vaccine that we really do understand now what the risks are of vaccine and some of the side effects. Once you've given that many doses of anything, there's really no more rare events that you can detect. In the United States, we've had over 43,370,000 cases of COVID and now approaching 700,000 deaths. And in the United States, we've given over 390 million doses of vaccine. In California, we're down to 2.6% test positivity. Our last update was a little over a week ago, so we've had a slight decline. It was 2.9% last week, but really slowly coming down into that range that we want to get to. Again, remember, less than 1%. When any virus positivity rate is less than 1%, you're not seeing the surges that we've been experiencing, and so we really are looking forward to that. We are, though, seeing an increase in deaths. That's not unexpected. We've seen it in California, in Fresno County, and across the United States. Anytime you have a surge in cases, you will have eventually a surge in deaths. In Fresno County, we are now at 128,068 cases and 1,957 deaths. We've had a sharp increase in deaths in the last week, 68 deaths since we last reported. And that should expect to increase. For youth, we've had about 900 additional cases, so our number of cases is coming down. We've had a little longer spread of time than the last time we reported, a little more than a week, and we're seeing fewer cases than we did when it was just a 1-week reporting period, so that's really positive. And if you look on the left-hand upper side, you'll see that graph starting to show a decline. Hospitalization, goodness gracious, finally we're seeing hospitalization come down. Even through the end of last week, we were still hovering in 360 to 380. And then over the weekend, and particularly over the last few days, we've seen a significant decline now at 296 individuals with confirmed COVID in the hospital, 62 of those in the ICU, big drop there, over 20. And 20 available ICU beds. So we're finally giving the healthcare system the breathing room that they desperately needed to be able to accommodate a lot of things, other healthcare conditions that need to be treated right now, as well as staff burnout and exhaustion. This is now our third wave of COVID, and staff in hospitals are just They're over it, quite frankly. All right, youth hospitalization has come down as well. You see that nice decline in the graph, both of hospitalized youth as well as youth in the ICU. That's all positive. And then our testing trends. We've had a decline in test positivity of about 1%. We went from 8.2% to 7.2%. Not where we need to be, frankly, but we are coming down, which is positive. In terms of vaccination, we've now vaccinated over 1.1 million doses. We have 477,453 individuals fully vaccinated, another 86,530 who are partially vaccinated. So in the last week plus, we've delivered a little over 17,000 doses. For youth, we have about 35,397 fully vaccinated, another 6,793 partially. Remember, these are youth 12 to 17, so a small segment of our population. As I reported last week, Pfizer has recommended that their vaccine at a reduced dose be given to youth between the ages of 5 and 11. That's going through the FDA approval process, but should be available in the next few months. All right, so in terms of what's happening in Fresno County, our quick graph to show that we had that little jump up, but going back down again. And then in terms of the tier, we do sadly remain in the purple tier, but hopefully with this reduction we've seen in the last few days, we'll get out of this purple tier into the red tier, etc. So our cases continue to decline, hospitalizations now dropping dramatically, deaths increasing as expected, and our positivity rate continues to slowly decrease. Same in California, drop in positivity even lower than ours, sharp decrease in hospitalization across the state, and deaths increasing. And then nationally, we have deaths per day again above 2,000 across the United States. Alaska now has the highest number of cases per capita. Some things that came out just today, the CDC is now strongly recommending pregnant women, women who are trying to become pregnant, and those breastfeeding all get the COVID vaccine. We now have 162 women who've gotten COVID and while they were pregnant who died. There have been some infant deaths as well related to that. 22 or so of those women were just in the last 30 days. And so the CDC now believes that there is enough evidence to strongly encourage women who are pregnant, who are trying to become pregnant, or who are breastfeeding to take the vaccine. And then the Pfizer booster is now widely available for all eligible populations, including high-risk occupations, such as healthcare providers. All right, and then this slide just shows you where you see the dark blue or the light bluish purple. Those are states where the average number of cases per capita is still going up, and then the orangish, yellowish color are states where it is coming down. So we are in a state that's kind of a graphical representation of the United States. You see really like a southwest to west skewing. Those are the states where it's going down, and the Midwest to the Northeast are all still experiencing slight increases. So I've frequently been asked about therapeutics. We talk about these vaccines. Why aren't we talking about what works to treat? And part of the challenge is there's been many drugs investigated, new drugs as well as existing drugs to treat COVID. And over 24 or so at this point. But there's not many that they found to actually work. You know, we talked last week about some of the uncertainty with science and how things are coming out much earlier and in a more public way, so what we call preprints or early study results that haven't been subject to scrutiny. And so lots of things have been touted as treatment or cures for COVID that later just have not proven to be the case, and in some cases been quite dangerous, in fact, for people to utilize. And so there are 2 FDA-approved treatments for COVID. One is the monoclonal antibodies that we talked about previously. Interestingly enough, these are made from people who've had COVID. And so they take the antibodies from people who've had COVID, and they've created these monoclonal antibodies to put into people who now have COVID to boost their immune system. So, we talked about this last week. There's a lot of scrutiny and concern about vaccines and what's in them and what they do to your body, but the treatments kind of do the same thing, right? They try and boost your immune system and teach your immune system to fight off COVID. The difference is the vaccine teaches your body that in anticipation that you'll get COVID, so if you get it, you won't get sick. Monoclonal antibodies, just like all the other treatments, you actually have to get COVID and all the risks that come with that, and then hope that those treat you. They prefer to give the monoclonal antibodies to individuals who are within 10 days of the onset of symptoms of COVID, but before they've been hospitalized. They've found that if people wait until they're hospitalized, while it helps some people, it doesn't help nearly as many as when you get it before you're hospitalized, before you're so sick that you need to be hospitalized. And then remdesivir is a drug that they give people when they're hospitalized that has been shown to improve people's symptomatology in the hospital setting. And then there's some approved treatments that don't necessarily interact with how COVID multiplies in your system, but dexamethasone is an anti-inflammatory steroid that's given. Prone positioning, which we've talked about before, just kind of relieves some of the pressure on your lungs, where the fluid that normally would pool in the back of your lungs, where you have more surface area when you're lying on your back. When you put people on the front, that pools in the front where you have less surface area. And so that's a way to give people a fighting chance, if you will, to free up lung space for that oxygen in those damaged lungs from COVID pneumonia, which are already restricting your ability to exchange oxygen, give you a little more surface area of your lungs to exchange oxygen. And then ventilators, which just are mechanically breathing. There's also ECMO, but that's given very late in the course of COVID. And then a lot of people who get COVID, who get very ill, get sepsis. And there's a number of drugs for that. But it's not really COVID treatment, it's the after effects of having COVID. And so that's really what's been approved. There's a number of things that are not approved, not recommended, and in fact dangerous. And that includes hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, ivermectin. I did hear this week that some horses are actually going to die because there is not enough ivermectin to treat the parasitic worm that ivermectin is used for in horses. And people have been going out and taking horse medicine, which is unproven for treatment of COVID, and now are putting horses at risk. And then oleandrin, lopinavir, and ritonavir are all drugs that they've tried, they've done studies, they just have not been found to be effective. All right. So vaccine mandate. Today is the deadline for individuals subject to the vaccine mandate to either be vaccinated or to have a vaccine exemption form filled out. And remember, that's either a medical reason that's signed by a provider or the religious exemption. And so we don't know exactly what will happen. That's being decided. HR and County Council today are working on the memo that employees will be getting who fall into this category of individuals who refuse to vaccinate or reveal their vaccination status and do not file an exemption, or even those who file an exemption but refuse to test will be subject to whatever is determined by Human Resources and County Council. And so as soon as that information comes out, we'll be sending that information out to those employees who are impacted by that direction, and we'll go from there. I did want to talk a little bit about, there is a historical precedence for vaccine mandates, and it's kind of interesting. You may have seen this in the news. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. In some ways, we owe our existence as a nation partly to a vaccine mandate. An immunization mandate, and that is that during the American Revolution, smallpox, which I talked about last week, was a big enough problem that the American Army, led by George Washington, was afraid that it would jeopardize the war. They were losing troops to smallpox, the illness and the deaths that they were experiencing. And that was the time that the treatment for smallpox was called variolation. And that's where, people would get scabs from having smallpox, and they would take a piece of the scab and expose someone to it, where they would get a smaller viral load, if you will, but they would get smallpox, and they had a much better chance of recovering. So it was a pretty high mortality rate if you got traditional smallpox, but only a 2 to 3% mortality rate if you got the variolation. And so George Washington decided they'd already lost one battle, the Battle of Quebec, because of smallpox. And so to prevent more, he ordered immunizations. Didn't want to tell the British about it because he did, when you get variolation, you can get sick, and he didn't want the British to understand that the troops would be sick. And it worked. Their smallpox cases plummeted. The Army survived a war of attrition against the British. And it was as important as any military measure in the American Revolution, this vaccine mandate, this variolation mandate. And so in the decades that follow, immunization treatments became safer than giving people an active virus like what happened with variolation with smallpox. And mandates became more common both in the military and beyond. But they did generate hostility and resistance. One thing about Americans, we like to protest and we like to disagree with things that we're told we should do. And so one pastor actually took it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1905, where he lost. And so, even 50 years later, when polio was just prevalent throughout the United States, there were still people dissenting. And so, vaccine mandates are nothing new. They've impacted the future of America in the past. And I imagine we'll hear a lot more about them in the days and weeks to come. All right. And then one other thing I just want to talk about, because I saw this this way that it was referred to. There's one state, I believe it's Maine right now, that has a pretty high vaccination rate, but continues to have a lot of cases. And I often get asked about, well, why should I get the vaccine? I could get COVID anyways or spread it to someone else. This just doesn't make any sense to me. So I thought I'd try and give you an analogy that we're kind of familiar with here in California, and that's fire and forest fires. So for many years in our forest above Fresno, we had a few different things happening. If you've lived in California for very long, you've always lived through droughts. I remember in the 70s living through a drought in California. But we had a few things happen with the drought the last several years where we also had the bark beetle, and the bark beetle really became prevalent in the forest of the Sierra Nevadas, largely because of the drought, but also because we didn't get low enough temperatures for long enough periods of time. So the bark beetle's been around for many, many years, many generations, but because we didn't have prolonged periods of extreme cold in the Sierras year after year, it was allowed to propagate. And that's when we started seeing all of the dying trees in the Sierra and really creating a really ripe environment for fire. You combine that with man-made fires and lightning strikes and all the things that have naturally happened in the forest, and you get a fire. So think of that fire as the virus. Viruses have been with us for thousands of years, and every once in a while they jump from animal to humans or emerge out of the soil. Maybe they escaped from a lab. One way or another, they're with us. And the intensity really depends on the fuel for the fire, right? So a lightning strike can cause a different type of fire than somebody throwing a cigarette out of a car, what have you, if they start low versus high and the load, etc. And we have that with viruses too. We get that viral load. Remember, we've talked about this a long time. Some people just carry a higher viral load than others. And the Delta variant, we're not really sure how it became more contagious. Why is it producing more sickness than the prior version of COVID? And then those conditions for fire are conditions for virus. We know some people are more prone to not having as good of an immune response. People over the age of 65, people with underlying health conditions, maybe pregnant women, we don't know. And so all of those conditions can exist that when a virus comes along, just like a fire, in one forest, it goes through and nothing burns. And in another forest, everything burns. I was up in the high Sierras this weekend and hiked up to an area where there had been a forest fire at the same time as the creek fire called the Bullfrog Fire because it started near Bullfrog Lake up by Courtright Reservoir. And walked through that burn area and saw the magnificent trees that truly were brought to their knees by this fire, burned from the inside out. And you know, that's what happens with some viruses. Even the strongest, biggest trees that have been there forever get burned up by the fire. If you go to a forest where there's lots of moisture in the ground and there's not a lot of dry areas or dead brush or dead trees, those fires don't take hold. And it's the same thing with the virus. And so the forest maintenance or the drought status, we know that some of us have more responsive immune systems or have underlying conditions that make those immune systems less responsive. And so, you know, I say all of this to tell you that yes, vaccines are kind of like, you know, having a good year for precipitation. They help fortify the forest. They help fortify our bodies so that when the threat comes, when the lightning strikes, when the fire comes, we have a better chance. One forest will do better when it has that, and our bodies will do better when they're vaccinated and our body's able to produce an antibody response. And so that doesn't mean that, you know, the virus can't still take people out who have an underlying health condition, that maybe their immune response was different than my immune response. It's just that we're trying to put as many protections as we can in place. We know with this last surge, 100% we know this, people who were unvaccinated greatly were out of proportion to people who were vaccinated, both in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. That's indisputable. It's not up for debate. And so that's why we're pushing the vaccines. And with that, I will go to your questions. Mandating soldiers to get vaccinated is a bit different than mandating free citizens just saying. Well, that's interesting. I'm going to read what the Supreme Court Justice wrote when he ruled against the pastor who did not want to take a smallpox vaccine. Justice John Marshall Harlan explained that the Constitution did not allow Americans always to behave however they chose. Real liberty for all could not exist, Harlan wrote in his majority opinion, if people could act regardless of the injury that may be done to others. And so basically what he was saying there is vaccine mandates aren't just about your own health. It's also how you contribute to the health of the community. And when we uphold your individual rights at the expense of others, the Constitution does not protect you from that. And that's what Justice Harlan was writing. And refusing to get vaccinated certainly could be a refusal to follow orders, but as I stated, there's other things to consider. And then a few other comments related to that. Let's see if I have any questions via text. A reminder to that staff are to wear masks inside DBH buildings. I'm breaking this rule right now during the presentation, but Brian has his mask on and we're pretty far from one another. But we do want to remind you, and I'm going to put my mask on and I'm going to show you how to properly wear a mask, because people oftentimes like to wear it like this, or like this, or like this. That's not proper, okay? Your mask behind your ears, your nose has to be covered, your mouth has to be covered, okay? Doesn't sit down here, doesn't sit down here. Not proper wearing, and you know, just like not following orders, that's an order. You have to wear your mask properly when you're on within the department. Okay, let's see. Kind of messes up my hair when I put my mask on, oh well. Let's see if there's any other questions. How are we addressing those who have had COVID-19 with presumed antibodies? Well, we're happy that they have some antibodies, but they still have to get the vaccine. That is, you know, we honestly do not know how long natural immunity lasts with having COVID. Just like when we give the vaccine to people with underlying health conditions, some people do not have an immune response. And so I think I shared this previously. I'll share it again. One of my best friends, her aunt, has an underlying health condition. She got 2 doses of the vaccine. They were not able to detect a single antibody in her response. And so that's one of the reasons they recommended a booster shot for people who have underlying health conditions. We don't always know when we have those underlying health conditions, and so we can't rely on natural immunity alone, and that's why the vaccines are being mandated. Additionally, some early studies have shown that you do, even if you have immunities, still some natural immunity from having had COVID, the vaccine gives you a boost to that immunity. And so again, there's no harm in getting that vaccine, and in fact, there's a benefit to getting the vaccine booster. It boosts your natural immunity. So all good with getting the vaccine. All right, I don't see any other questions here. I'm going to check my texts one more time. And with that, stay tuned. Those of you who the vaccine mandate applies to, who have chosen not to comply with the vaccine mandate, you'll be getting some communication in the next day or two, alerting you to what the consequences of that will be. And we'll be communicating that as soon as we have that information. If you have any other questions after this, or you're watching a recording, please feel free to email us those questions. We have one more here. What percentage of DBH employees have been granted a medical exemption and religious exemption? And do we know what percentage vaccinated our department is currently? I don't have those numbers right off the top of my head, but I can tell you that in the early results of vaccination, we had over 80% of our staff were vaccinated, and I believe that number has went up in the last 30 to 60 days since I was given that information. Next week I'll report out a little more specifically on those numbers. And so that's that answer. All right, I don't see any other questions. We will be back next week. Have a good weekend.